All right, everyone. I think we're going to start to get started here. We'll do a brief introduction. I'm sure we'll have a couple more people trickle in as I kind of start us up here. My name is Michael Dax. I'm the New Mexico representative for Defenders of Wildlife based here in Santa Fe. I want to welcome you to the second session of the New Mexico Beaver Summit. This was an event that we began planning with Wild Earth Guardians and New Mexico Department of Game and Fish and the New Mexico Environment Department and a number of other partners back in February before COVID. Initially our plan was to have an in-person event followed by a number of field trips where we look at beaver restoration sites and habitat sites and all sorts of good stuff like that. But we are however many months into the pandemic, and there's so much momentum and interest around beaver conservation and restoration that we wanted to keep continue that momentum and not lose it by waiting for when an in-person event might be possible again. So thank you for all of you for attending our first panel, our first session on Tuesday had really good participation, and it looks like we're going to have similarly robust participation today. So our first panel was about living with beaver. This panel is called Why Beavers. So in some ways, these were kind of reversed just based on scheduling availability of all of our panelists. So our panel today is really going to take a fundamental look at from both a historical, cultural, and ecological perspective of why beavers are such an important part of the ecosystem, especially in arid states like New Mexico. Then on Monday, so just a couple days from now, at the same time, we are going to have our third panel, which is restoring beavers. So we're going to talk about habitat restoration activities and translocation activities that have been underway in New Mexico and how we could expand those. And then on Wednesday, November 4th, we are having our final panel, which is a vision of the future. And we'll be talking about next steps for what New Mexico could do to bring beavers fully back to their ecological role. And that panel will feature Mary O'Brien with the Grand Canyon Trust. So we are going to have 4 speakers today. Ben Goldfarb will be our first speaker. Megan Conway with New Mexico Game and Fish. Kai T. Blue Sky, and Bill Zedike. So if we are ready to get started, we will start off with Ben, but first I would just ask that if you are not a panelist or not a presenter, if you could please stop your video. Just, we have a lot of people here and want to make sure there's not any skipping or anything like that. At the end of, once all the panelists have presented, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat box. However, if you have a very pressing question or that's kind of just very on point, we may have opportunities to take questions in between the panelists. So feel free to type those questions in, and we will filter those through as we go over the course of the next couple hours. So our first panelist today is Ben Goldfarb. Ben is the author of Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. And if you haven't read it, it really is a fantastic book. I'm sure we have a lot of true beaver believers on the webinar today. But even if you are not a beaver fanatic, I guarantee you'll find it really fascinating and a really engaging read. It was the winner of the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award and named one of the best books by the Washington Post in 2018. Ben's writing has also appeared in The Atlantic, Science, The Washington Post, National Geographic, The New York Times, High Country News, and Orion Magazine. So without any further ado, we are going to turn our first panel over to Ben.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Michael, and thank you all for being here today. Let me just share my screen and play the slideshow. Can you guys see that okay? Is that working? Thumbs up. Okay, cool. So yes, I don't live in New Mexico. I live in Spokane, Washington. A similar landscape in some ways. You know, I'm up here in the high desert. So my talk, you know, I'm going to address sort of some regional beaver history in New Mexico. Although I'm sure there are people on this call who sort of know more of the local fur trade history than I do. But also try to put sort of what happened in New Mexico to beavers in kind of this broader national historic context. So I think that you know, an important place to begin is just understanding how tremendously consequential and significant beavers were as these landscape scale engineers and architects in the first place. You know, we don't really know how many beavers lived in North America prior to European arrival and the fur trade, but the best guess we have is that there were as many as 400 million beavers in North America. And of course, those hundreds of millions of beavers would have created hundreds of millions of beaver dams and ponds and wetlands. You know, again, the best kind of back of the envelope estimate we have is, you know, there are as many as 150 to 250 million beaver ponds on this continent. And, you know, again, a little bit of back of the envelope math suggests that, you know, perhaps 235,000 square miles of landscape were impounded by beavers. And just for a bit of reference, that's the kind of the area of Arizona and Nevada combined. So just tremendous amounts of land were occupied and inundated by beavers. And, you know, certainly beavers were an incredibly abundant, prolific, prominent species in the Southwest as well. Again, we don't have, you know, really any, as far as I know, any accurate historic population estimates for New Mexico and other Southwestern states, but we know they were here in force. This is a beaver dam that I stopped by in the Rio Hondo outside its house. And, you know, there are a million quotes like this, but here's one quote from James Ohio Patty, you know, an early white explorer of the Southwest, who described, you know, floating down the river and camping in the middle of beaver sign. And, you know, every sort of Southwestern explorer and Taos trapper, their journals are just filled with observations about the abundance and impact of beaver. So we know this was a species that was really dominant and prevalent in the Southwest historically. Of course, we also know that beavers are a keystone species. This is a term that you guys have probably heard a lot over the course of the summit and we'll be hearing more of. But, you know, what that phrase means basically is that in architecture, the keystone is the top block in a stone arch. And when you pull that top block, the whole arch crumbles. And likewise, beavers are supporting a disproportionate load in aquatic ecosystems around the American West. You know, in the West, we know that wetlands comprise about 2% of total land area and support around 80% of biodiversity. So any species that's capable of essentially creating more wetlands with their dams and ponds is disproportionately important. And, you know, the list of species that depend on beavers is a long and exhaustive and practically endless one. You know, a few quick ones at kind of the national level. Here's a really lovely great blue heron rookery that I visited at a beaver complex recently. Of course, we know that moose are basically beaver pond obligates in many places and really depend on beavers for habitat. Amphibians, like this boreal toad, are tremendously dependent on beavers. Here's kind of a cool one. This is a beaver pond complex that I visited in Minnesota, and here you can sort of see at the far edge is the old beaver dam. And basically, the dam breached, the pond drained, leaving this kind of beautiful wet meadow behind, and then a wolf pack actually took up residence inside the beaver lodge. So there's beavers creating habitat for their direct predator. I think that's pretty amazing. And certainly beavers are a huge component of wolf diets and would have been a really important prey species for Mexican wolves historically. And then, of course, you know, salmonids are tremendous beaver beneficiaries. This is a juvenile steelhead in the Columbia River Basin in Oregon. But similar dynamic applies for, say, the Rio Grande cutthroat trout, which you guys have in New Mexico, of course. And look, if you're a juvenile salmonid, a trout, you don't want to live in the main stem river. You're just going to get blown downstream. You want to live in a pool or a side channel or a backwater or an eddy. You want that complex, slow water refugia that beavers create. So we know there are a million studies out there connecting beavers to increased salmonid production. So this notion that beavers are crucial keystone species on the landscape is certainly not a new one to Western science. And and I know that another speaker later in the summit today is going to talk about beavers' role in sort of local native history and culture and ecology. But I think it's important to remember that the native tribes all over North America were deeply connected to beavers, particularly in the American West. The Blackfeet, for example, considered beavers essentially a sacred species and had cultural prohibitions against killing beavers because they recognized that beavers created these ecological oases on an otherwise very dry and arid landscape. So the notion that restoring beavers is critical to ecosystems in North America is certainly not something that originated with 20th century white Western scientists. So a lot of what I try to do in the course of working on my book was go back through old trappers and historian and explorers journals and diaries and Native American oral histories, looking for sort of testament to what North America would have looked like prior to the industrial fur trade. And there are a million wonderful testaments to that fact, many in New Mexico and elsewhere in the Southwest. Here's one really nice one, I think, from Lewis, of course, of Lewis and Clark fame, in Montana, in the Missouri Basin, describing a number of beaver dams succeeding each other up every tributary of the Missouri River as far as the eye could see, up to the base of the mountains. And in many places, actually, the Corps of Discovery couldn't use those valley bottoms because they were so thoroughly impounded by beavers. They had to travel along the ridge lines. And you hear similar testament from some of the Taos trappers as well. So there's no question this was once a much greener, bluer, lusher, wetter, beaver-occupied landscape. So Lewis and Clark were making those observations, in 1805. In 1843, just 38 years later, John James Audubon traveled the exact same route, looking for a beaver to paint, and he couldn't find a single beaver in this vast watershed where Lewis and Clark had found them ubiquitous just 4 decades earlier. So what happened to beavers? What did they turn into? Well, of course, they became hats, right? I think that some people hear the phrase beaver hat and think of a big furry Davy Crockett-like thing, but in fact, beaver hats were kind of these, elegant sort of Victorian style top hats that they came in many styles that were all the rage in Europe. Starting in the kind of the 17th century. And the reason that beavers make such good hats is that beavers have 2 layers of fur. They've got these long, coarse outer guard hairs. Those are the reddish hairs you can see there. And then they also have the under fur, or what trappers refer to as the beaver wool. And if you were to look at those under hairs under a microscope, you'd see that each one has kind of a little hook or barb at the end, which means that when you felt it, it locks together and creates this really durable, pliable, waterproof hat-making material that was just incredibly valuable. And it's really hard to overstate the extent to which the pursuit of beaver pelts really drove early American history. Practically every significant event prior to the Civil War had some kind of beaver connection. The Revolutionary War was partly inspired by the British denying colonists access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachians. The Louisiana Purchase was partly fueled by Jefferson's desire to secure new grounds for trapping. Here's kind of a nice picture that I like. So I live in Spokane, which is part of the historic Oregon Territory, and in the Oregon Territory, they minted these beaver coins in 1849, and the value of 1 beaver coin was fixed to the value of 1 beaver pelt. just as people advocate going to the gold standard today, the entire economy of the Pacific Northwest operated under the pelt standard. And of course, it's important to emphasize too that it was beaver traders and trappers who spread smallpox and many of the other diseases that so ravaged many Native American tribes. So the story of the fur trade is really the story of early American history in all of its kind of grandeur and tragedy. It's also profoundly connected to the story of the Southwest. Of course, the first white Americans who came to New Mexico were people like Kit Carson, following the Santa Fe Trail from the Missouri River into the Southwest. So it was that beaver trade, of course, that brought the Taos trappers to Taos in the first place. That's what they were trapping, obviously, was beaver, along with other fur bearers. Now, the impact that those Taos trappers had is really vast and even kind of mind-boggling in some ways, I think. Here's just the sheer number of beavers that were trapped out of the Jemez Mountains and the Sangre de Cristos and elsewhere in New Mexico is pretty remarkable. Here's again James Ohio Patty describing floating down river, trapping beavers as fast as they could wish, bringing in 60 in a morning, which is pretty astonishing, I think. Another kind of amazing testament to the just rapacity of the trade was of course the famous New Mexico writer Bill Du Bois describing how in 1824 alone, out of the Sangre de Cristos, trappers took 2,000 beavers, just a huge percent of the population. And actually, New Mexico was really the first place to pass any kind of beaver conservation laws. In 1838, there were some beaver laws passed, basically protecting them, but it's very unlikely that they were enforced at all. So that the slaughter didn't really cease until the 1840s, when beavers had been essentially extirpated from the Southwest. So, in addition to being a hugely consequential historical event, the fur trade was also this profoundly influential ecological, even geological event, right? We don't really think about the fur trade in the same terms as we think about, the deforestation of New England, or the busting of the Midwestern prairie, or, gold mining in the Sierra Nevada as this kind of seminal ecological catastrophe. But there's no question that it was. Right? What happens when you trap out hundreds of millions of beavers? Well, of course, hundreds of millions of beaver dams break down, and hundreds of millions of beaver ponds drain, and hundreds of millions of acres of habitat are lost. What did it mean for the New Mexico jumping mouse, or the Rio Grande cutthroat, or moose or coho salmon up here in the Northwest, that they lost all of that beaver created habitat? We'll never really understand the true impact of the fur trade, I don't think, but there's no question that it was this profoundly dramatic, important, disastrous geological and ecological force. And I think that we're still trying to understand just what a dramatic force that it was. Here's a stream that I'm sure many of you people have seen around the Southwest, and this is a stream in Wyoming, but it's pretty archetypal, I think, where you see this really dramatic incision and down cutting and disconnection of the stream from the floodplain. And I think that we look at this stream and think, well, maybe that's the impact of overgrazing or of mining or something like that. But in this case, this was a stream that was degraded specifically due to the loss of beavers, right? In a healthy beaver-rich system, all of those beaver dams are basically speed bumps, slowing water down, spreading it out, inundating that floodplain. And when you wipe out beavers and lose those beaver-built speed bumps, there's nothing checking the velocity of water, and you get this really dramatic erosion and incision and floodplain disconnection. So these kinds of degraded systems, in many cases around the American West, are an artifact of beaver trapping in the 19th century. So fortunately, so by 1900 or so, the beaver population in North America has really reached its nadir. There are maybe 100,000 beavers left, pretty much all up in Canada. Beavers are basically gone from the Southwest and really most of the American West. But right around then, fortunately, biologists start to wise up a little bit. Enos Mills, who's kind of a mentee of John Muir's, writes this wonderful book where he posits that a live beaver is more valuable than a dead one, which is kind of a heretical notion at the time. But all over the country, beaver reintroduction begins. California, Oregon, Washington, all have beaver reintroduction projects. In New Mexico, it takes a little bit longer, but in 1947, really the late 40s and most of the 1950s, there are some pretty major beaver reintroductions in New Mexico. Of course, the most famous beaver reintroduction, which maybe you guys know about, actually occurred near where I live in Idaho. And I'll just show you a little bit of YouTube video here, just because it's so much fun, I think. So in Idaho in 1948, they wanted to move some beavers into the kind of the what is today the Frank Church Wilderness out in the backcountry, far from people. And at first they tried moving them on horseback. The beavers, as you might expect, didn't take too kindly to that. But fortunately, it was 1948, just post World War II. They've got some surplus airplanes and parachutes on hand. And one of these state fish and game biologists has the bright idea of moving beavers in kind of these specialized crates, of parachuting some beavers into the Idaho backcountry. So in 1948, they drop 76 beavers out of airplanes in kind of these special built crates with parachutes attached. 75 of the beavers actually survived. One beaver, unfortunately, escaped from the crate midair and fell to his death. Very sad. But the rest of them actually sort of recovered and occupied the landscape. And when they flew back over this part of Idaho the next year, they found ponds and wetlands every place the beavers had been dropped. So this was state of the art at the time. I'm not sure whether anybody airlifted beavers into New Mexico or just moved them on horseback or by truck, but that was one crazy project. So, of course, throughout the 20th century, beavers are recovering. They're occupying the habitat and the landscapes they used to occupy. But of course, they find that in their absence, we've thoroughly colonized the landscape as well, right? And it turns out that good beaver habitat and good human habitat are basically one and the same. We both like these nice low gradient streams and kind of fertile floodplains. That's where we build our railroads and our roads and our towns and our farms and all of our infrastructure, and also where beavers like to live. And when beavers and humans overlap, problems can arise. I'd argue that more often than not, it's us who is the nuisance species. But there's no question that beavers can be challenging to live with. And I know that Aaron Hall got into some of this stuff during his talk earlier this week. But just a quick review of beaver conflict. Here's a set of railroad tracks that I visited in Massachusetts. These tracks had just been sort of refurbished at a cost of about $1 million. And within 3 months of their completion, beavers had them underwater. Here's a house that I bet many of you guys have seen. This is on the way to the Taos Ski Valley. I stopped by there a few years ago, and I'm sure many of you know this spot. But what I love about this particular kind of beaver complex that many of you have possibly observed is that so beavers kind of build their dam, or they begin their dam over here in the top left corner of the screen. Then they build up to the base of this cabin. Then they continue on the other side. So I wouldn't want to be that landowner, but you have to kind of admire the ingenuity of the beavers there. So if anybody knows anything about this house, by the way, I always wondered who it belongs to and how it came to be and cable near Taos and kind of ruined cell phone and internet service for 24 hours. Some of you probably remember that event. So beavers get into all kinds of interesting creative trouble. So of course, the way that those sorts of conflicts are generally handled is by trapping out the offending beaver, almost always lethally. And again, I know that Aaron talked a little bit about this, but while trapping makes a lot of intuitive sense, a couple issues. I mean, first, of course, when you eliminate the beavers, you're eliminating that wonderful pond and wetland habitat they're creating. But from a cost-benefit standpoint, all you're doing is opening up a vacancy for the next family of beavers, right? As long as the habitat is there, the beavers will always return. And I think that for that reason and for other reasons as well, it makes sense to explore non-lethal options. I know that Aaron talked a lot about tree fencing and flow devices during his talk earlier this week. But here's one really nice case study that I like in Colorado near Salida, where the land trust that managed this little sort of lakeside property, they basically fenced off these kind of beautiful, riparian cottonwoods they wanted to protect from beavers, and then left unfenced these non-native Siberian elm trees, which the beavers then felled. So that's invasive vegetation management using a beaver as your agent. I think that's a pretty cool story. So the takeaway to me is that the fact that we take this kind of knee-jerk reflexive lethal approach to beaver management is problematic, and is preventing or slowing down the further recovery of beavers in New Mexico and really throughout the United States. But I think that in New Mexico, as in many Western states, and this is certainly true here in Eastern Washington where I live, the thing that's most impeding beaver recovery isn't necessarily trapping. It's really about land management, I think, in many cases. This is again a scene that I'm sure is familiar to many of you. A cow grazing in the riparian area, and in New Mexico in particular, which has this kind of ancient history of cattle grazing that dates back to the Spanish. Of course, so many riparian areas have been impacted by grazing. And there's a great study done by Brian Small, who was then a graduate student at the University of New Mexico. And he basically found that there's around one beaver colony for every 50 or so stream miles of sort of grazed public land in New Mexico. Just for reference, in a kind of a healthy system, you're looking at 1 to 3 beaver colonies per stream mile in many cases. So Brian's point is that because livestock grazing in riparian areas is impeding the growth of willow, of course there's no available food and building resource for beavers, and that's what's really holding back beaver recovery on public lands is cattle grazing. So I just wanted to sort of conclude by sharing a case study that I love talking about from Nevada. I think that the takeaway here is that it's true that cattle grazing is impeding beaver recovery, but you don't really have to do all that much to allow beavers to return and flourish. So here's this case study is from Maggie Creek, which is this stream in northeast Nevada in Elko County. And you can see this is what Maggie Creek looked like after about 100 years of unmanaged grazing, just completely blasted to smithereens by cattle. But luckily in the early 1990s, the Bureau of Land Management and the ranchers who grazed that allotment began to sort of collaborate to put in some very basic common sense grazing prescriptions. Just sort of they put in some riparian fencing, and they kind of changed the grazing intervals so that cows weren't spending as much time in the stream bottom during the hot season, and slowly willow and cattail and other riparian plants began to recover. And in this story, beavers were not, nobody introduced or reintroduced beavers to this system. Nobody was really thinking about beavers. Beavers just kind of magically showed up, once the available habitat and food resource was there, and began to build dams and do their thing. So this is what Maggie Creek looked like in 1980. I want you to keep this picture in your mind and then check out the next picture, which is from 2017, after 30 years or so of managed grazing and maybe 20 years of beaver recovery. So just remember this picture and then check out this, right? That's pretty cool. So you might look at this and say, well, wait a second, I don't actually see any beavers. What are beavers doing in here? Well, all of this cattail growth is actually growth atop an old beaver dam. So beavers are really deeply embedded into this system. And the researchers who studied this complex basically found that beavers created 20 more acres of open water, right? So they're building dams, creating ponds, spreading water out. They actually added 3 miles of wetted stream length to the stream. So back when the stream looked like this, it was so degraded it was going dry before reaching its confluence with the Humboldt River. But by slowing water down, beavers ensured there would still be water in the stream come August, September, the hot, dry season. So beavers aren't stealing water, right? They're just slowing the water down and turning this seasonal stream into a perennial one. I think that's really amazing. They also raised the water table by 2 feet, right? When you look at a beaver pond, there's all of the kind of the visible surface water that you can see. But what you don't see is the weight of that pond forcing itself into the ground, recharging aquifers, hydrating soils, raising that water table, basically sub-irrigating, really vast expanses of valleys. So, thanks to this beaver irrigation function, these researchers documented a 100-acre increase in riparian vegetation. And that's really a big deal, of course, for local livestock producers. This is James Rogers, who's one of the ranchers in Elko County who's really embraced beavers. And the observation that he made when I visited him is that beavers were basically increasing floodplain production by tenfold, right? And that means more weight on his cattle and more money in his back pocket. So now in Northeast Nevada, there's this wonderful cluster of pro-beaver ranchers who have really seen what beavers can do and as a result embraced them. So again, I think the moral of that story is that you don't have to change grazing that dramatically to reap some pretty substantial benefits. So I guess, given all of the wonderful things that beavers do, why aren't they more widely beloved and embraced? And, to me, a lot of that is just because we've forgotten what our landscapes are supposed to look like, right? We have this, the kind of this historical ecological amnesia that began when we wiped out beavers and degraded the landscape in profound ways. I think if you ask most people what a healthy stream should look like, they would think of something like this, kind of a fast, straight, single thread, free flowing, gravel bottomed or cobble bottomed stream that, you could see in a Field and Stream magazine or an Orvis catalog. I don't think most people picture a beaver complex as being the healthy, natural alternative. But of course it is. Beaver ponds provide all of these wonderful services that we've talked about, not just for wildlife, but for humans as well. And that's just especially important as we enter this era of climate change. It's so vital that we keep water up in the high country as we lose our snowpack. And beavers, of course, do exactly that, right? There's really no elevational limit to where beavers can be. Here's a beaver complex that I think up there, come the hot, dry season. So these kinds of beaver-built reservoirs up in the high country are going to be increasingly important throughout the 21st century. So to wrap it all up, we have this amazing animal that provides all of these wonderful services, both for wildlife and for human users. It does it for free, and it doesn't require permits. So I know you guys are going to hear from Bill Zedike in a little bit, and I know that Bill's mantra, of course, is let the water do the work. But the little tweak that the beaver believers have made to that idea is let the rodent do the work, right? Let's get out of the way and let beavers do what they do. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. There's already been at least one question in the chat. So if you have a question and you don't want to forget it, type it in now and we'll get to it later. But I want to keep on moving along, and we're going to move right along to our next speaker, Kai T. Blue Sky. Kai T is a wildlife biologist who has immense experience working for the Mescalero Tribal Fishery Hatchery, the Pueblo of Tezuka Environment Department, and the Pueblo of Cochiti Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. And currently he teaches ecology and biology at the Santa Fe Indian School, and also does program curriculum development. So you could imagine that right now Kai T is a very busy guy, and we are very happy and thankful to have him with us. So Kai T, I believe you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, all right. In just a moment. All right. Apologies, damn it. All right, so you can see this picture I have here. And what I'm showing is a philosophical worldview. And I know I'm teaching to the choir here about ecological systems. And so I want to bring to the forefront some aspects of philosophical worldview. And that's pretty much a way to look at the world through indigenous eyes, if you will. And so there are varying perspectives of how we look at the mountains. And so for one, it could be for ecological systems through Western science. For Native people, it's looking at the world in holistic reasoning and manner, from the top of the watersheds down to the river bottoms, and looking at the ecological systems in it. And so there's a way to live with Earth and a way not to live with Earth. And we choose the way of Earth. So we're shooting for ecology, right? And I know we're looking at the systems and understanding how beavers fluctuate and enhance the ecosystems. And so when we're talking about ecosystem, I want to be able to bring to light some ideas that the human aspect, as I was mentioned before. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it relates back to how we work together to achieve common goals and common aspirations. And so for some folks, and as I ask people, what is their definition of value? Their definition of value sometimes will relate back to money, monetary gain, profit, economic development. When I ask my grandparents and our grandfolks, their definition of value, they hug the grandchildren. They say our language, our culture, our way of life, the environment that supports our way of life, that supports our cultural way of life. And so there's two differing perspectives of how we look at the world, even as it goes into restoration. Because many a times the places of the Shangri-Las, if you will, for wildlife are on tribal lands. But yet there's a disconnect of how we work together. And it goes back to that idea of looking at the world as a commodity to be bought and sold versus my grandparents and our cultural way of life of how we look at the world. And I bring this up as a way of point of how we can meet on a middle ground as it comes to access, as it comes to working multiple jurisdictional boundaries. Because wildlife are the perfect segue to that conversational piece because they don't have borders. We're the only suckers that see jurisdictional boundaries. And I feel honored and privileged to be able to discuss this topic with you in the likes of Mr. Bill Zedike. It's an honor. But letting nature do the work and seeing that we're not necessarily apart from it, but we're merely a strand in the web of life. And so beavers, their engineering are slowing down the water, the energy flow from the top of the watershed. And so living in this crazy world, this is Cochiti, the picture on the left. This is old Cochiti. This is where the Vargas actually attacked. Cochiti in essence is Kutiet, is the mountains. Kutiteme is a person from the mountains, and it's a Cochiti. And so the mountains are our ancestral homelands. We're still alive, we're still functioning, we're still here. And so I'll bring to the point the idea of, and through this little thing I drew for y'all, was a climate cleidogram and form and function of the universe, and finding our place in that. Amongst beavers, amongst the many different functioning ecosystems, even the Douglas firs with their mycorrhiza and the interconnected communications between the plant world, abiotic and biotic. But looking at the waves, if you will, for precipitation, vegetation, primary consumer, looking at the astrological, the five spheres, if you will, the astrological to the atmosphere, to the hydrosphere, to the biosphere, to the lithosphere, and those complements of ecosystem function. So if we, as humans, being human, to be able to tie into those natural fundamental aspects of physiology, chemistry, biology, and working with nature, not necessarily trying to control it, but working with it, such as beavers, deceivers, working with beavers in a way that they're able to do what they need to do, but adjust it to suit our needs as well as human beings. And so, let me see where I can find this. Just give me just a moment. I apologize. But I want to bring this to the forefront. And so in our areas in Coach T, we've seen a mass amount of fires. And this is from the La Mesa fire in 1977 to the Dome fire in 96 to the San Miguel in 2009 to the Cerro Grande in 2000 to the Los Conchas in 2011. It's not a matter of if the fires are coming, but when. And so this is not a topic that is just whimsical. This is in our backyard. This is what we see. And so that's what I'm talking about, the jurisdictional aspects, because we have individuals from the Forest Service, National Park Service, from BLM, from governmental agencies, non-governmental agencies, wanting to do the same thing, common goals, common aspiration, ecosystem function. We know. It's getting to that point of working together collaboratively, realistically, not coming to a tribe in the aftermath, in the after effect of, or what do you guys want as a tribe? You guys already know. And then you take the knowledge and then we add it to it. We want ecosystem function. We want good quality water. We want clean water. These wildlife are the indicators to ecosystem function, not just for the area, for the biome, for the regional. And I bring up this map as a way to have us realize and recognize some facets that we need to understand relative to to human impacts, because these fires are raging in around Los Alamos National Laboratories, where the Manhattan Project happened. And Coach T is the first community downstream from this facility that created the atomic bombs, that continues with the manufacturing of nuclear weapons. And what does a fire do? It speeds up that ecological process, the flooding events that happen. It's in the water. It's not just about beavers. To look at beavers is to isolate and marginalize the idea. It's the deductive isolation of that topic, that when we're talking about beavers, we're talking about ecological system function and health. And so there's two ways to look at the world. One, through monetary and economic development gains. And we can see that that's the reason why National Park Service wants to propose to change to a national park versus a national monument. So we're looking at ecosystem function and humans as that part of that function. And this is not just talking out of this is shooting from, this is a flooding event in my backyard. Had there been beavers at the top of the watershed, this might not have happened. But cattle growers or cattle grazers and the Forest Service allowing cattle to graze in areas where there's been a severe fires. It brings up another point about how we move forward as beavers as being one component to be able to talk about this topic. So we're looking at quite a few things of seed development. We're not finding the plants that we normally would find in the mountains. We can't find the osha. We can't find the ginseng. We cannot find these plants because of the I'd say the disconnect between the ecosystem functions. So again, we're looking at ecosystem function here. And I want to be able to show you guys this slide here, because this is what we're looking at. And I want to be able to bring this closer to home as we look at the root development through ecosystem functions. Just beyond beavers, I talked about the wildfires and the world perspectives, the world views of how we look at the world through deforestation, through looking at what are the motives for different agencies, and if beavers and ecosystem functions are truly a part of the conversation. Let's look at how we can work together realistically and not just talk about it. It's not a we against us, or it's not a us against them. It's not about race or color. It's not about community. It's about humanity and how we move forward in this ever-changing world. Again, we've seen 5 catastrophic wildfires. This is Cochiti Canyon before the fires and after the fires. This is Bland Canyon before the fires and after the fires. This is Cochiti Canyon on fire. This is Peralta Canyon with a flood coming down. More water came down these canyons than is in the Rio Grande itself. This is a quarter-mile away from my house. We shall survive. This is Cochiti at Old Cochiti Village. We do our best to get up there as much as possible. We include Forest Service. As you can see, there's Forest Service staff. I believe Ruben Montes is there as well. And so the stories of our trees, and so reforestation is not isolated to just one component, but this is, I'll just show you a little bit of what we're doing and making those partnerships a reality. Working with a number of different partners that have common goals and common aspirations. And making that link from middle school, from little kids to middle school to high school to college, to be able to come back with a different mind view, and that is not economically minded, but it speaks to what our grandparents were talking about relative to our connection to the universe. And so we've been helping out Santa Clara Pueblo with the middle school. We've been planting trees. This is our archaeological ecological science and a wildlife biology class. We planted 3,000 Douglas firs in Santa Fe Indian School and in the Cochiti Mountains. And when I say the Cochiti Mountains, I'm addressing the mountains right behind Cochiti, which some people will call the Jemez Mountains. I call it the Cochiti Mountains. We also been planting trees in these forests. In the picture, there's a picture of the Cochiti Canyon before the fires. This is us walking miles into the canyons. This is us planting trees. Douglas fir cloning, regeneration. To be able to educate these young folks, as Confucius says, plant for a year, plant rice, plant for 10 years, plant trees, plant for 100 years, teach. So we made that connection with collecting seeds in New Mexico and helping out New Mexico State University through the seed research at Mora. Those trees then were shipped to Colorado State University at Fort Collins, which we work collaboratively with Colorado State Forestry. Those trees then were brought back down through research, the ongoing research, and just showing you a little bit of what we're teaching the students. But they came from Fort Collins, and those trees were then distributed to the high school's science classes. So now we're not just helping one tribe, we're doing our best to help out as many tribes as possible with reforestation. Trees, Water, and People organization, awesome people, great. The world globalization, about food sovereignty, cook stoves, reforestation, renewable energy. And so Santa Fe Indian School, we're doing our best to put ourselves in a position to assist tribes with reforestation, which brings in the Beavers of how we can collaborate at Cochiti Pueblo. I work at Santa Fe Indian School, and I can do my best to support efforts within my means. And so at Coach T Pueblo, we didn't go to war against beavers. What we did was we wrapped the trees with pig wire to save the trees we wanted, but allowed them to knock down trees to make those adjustments in their engineering crafts. And so Santa Fe Indian School, we're continuing with the reforestation. But really, again, we're going back to that original conversation about reconnecting ourselves to the universe as a humanity. So instead of going towards economic driven ideas like to burn down Amazon for agricultural development, let's rewind ourselves and reconnect ourselves to who we are and our symbiotic relationship with the world. Are we a parasite? Are we mutualistic? And I hope you really understand where I'm going with this. Because as we look at jurisdictional boundaries, we can come to these ideas of, and this is a picture of Coach T with jurisdictional boundaries again. And so trying to work with National Park Service, it hits its bumps. While working with the Forest Service, it almost there. Working with Game and Fish, we released some bighorn sheep. Working with Mescalero Apache tribe, we released some turkeys in Coach T. Working with Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, San Domingo Pueblo. So it's working, it's building a bridge between people to do ecological, or hard to say, to help our ecological function for humanity. And so these are some of the efforts that we're doing within our school system to be able to shift this dynamic in how we look at the world and how we're going to move forward with functioning as human beings, because we cannot fix the problems with the same thinking we created them with, as Einstein says. So it's looking at the bigger picture of humanity globally, if you will. And I hope that opened up some doors and avenues to conversations. Were there any questions? Is there any questions?
So I believe T won't be able to stay for the entire meeting. So if you do have any questions for him, let's pause for a second and give folks a chance to type any questions into the chat that you might have.
I greatly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Wow. Do you have any questions, anybody? I know I'm preaching to the choir here about ecological function, but I wanted to bring a little bit different aspect of a human nature of, if Coach T is a sundial, doesn't have a sundial, is a sundial, take that same pattern and flex it to the mountains. And the mountains are no longer rocks, trees, they're a part of us as we are part of them.
So we did have one question here. Are all the agencies working together? Do they realize the possibilities? And I think you maybe touch on that a little bit. So I guess it's especially speaking from the perspective of your position at Coach T.
Yeah, I'm not working with Coach T right now. I turned and I'm now a full-time high school teacher, and so I'm a concerned citizen, if you will. I'm a biologist by trade. I continue to help as best as I can, but right now I'm a full-time teacher at Santa Fe Indian School.
All right. So we actually had another question. How responsive have government agencies been to incorporating traditional values and methods?
They have been very they have been listening, but it's again taking the idea of biopiracy, if you will, where some folks had asked our input or my input, and as the project went forward, I found our community was left out. The project got funded and we were left out. But they had our words in it. They had our knowledge incorporated. But when the project got funded, I saw the partners in there. We weren't even listed. We weren't even a part of that idea. And then in after fact, we were asked, can we pass through Coach T to do the project, which was supposed to be a multi-jurisdictional project? So after you left us out of the project, you want to ask us to go through our tribal lands? So no, that's just me personally.
So we have another question from Eric. He says that he appreciates the holistic aspect. Is your tribal government involved, or is this more of a citizen initiative?
This is my own. I'm not speaking officially, and this is a citizen initiative that I've been working with for quite a while. Uh, Relocating turkeys to Coach T, working with Game and Fish for the big horse sheep release in the Coach T Mountains behind our reservation. Um, Working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with the Youth Conservation Corps, with Coach T Lake, with the perennial streams. I'm still involved as a scientist, although I'm not working with Coach T specifically. So I cannot speak officially.
All right, and another question from Chris. Speaking with my younger nieces and nephews makes me optimistic about some of the ideas you proposed. Is it the same when you engage with your students at Santa Fe Indian School?
Yes, and so if going on the idea of deductive logic and holistic logic and reasoning, if politicians really wanted to be champions of the people, why not push for having a human legal right to water? Why not have a human legal right to the river and all the tributaries? Why not have a human legal right to the mountains, the same as corporations? And so it just throws a twist at looking at the world as a commodity to be bought and sold if it has a human legal right, which goes back to the essence of humanity, Father, human, Mother Earth, and Father Sky. And would you treat your mother this way? And so going back into how to say the parallels and the relativity of how we look at the world, it really has to shift. It really has to shift, and it goes back to what you value. What is your value system? What is your definition of value? What are your priorities?
So just as my own quick follow-up on that, so even with all the technology that your students must have access to now, these are ideas that still resonate with them and they still get excited about?
Oh, most definitely. Technology has lifted up some, elevated many people to be on the same playing field, because many times data was only held by colleges, universities, and governmental agencies. Now we have cell phones that are actually PCs. We can do mapping. We can find borders. We have a um, personal computer right at our hands, and so it brings up boundaries, some issues that were long standing that were in question. Now we have cell phones that can go to a boundary point and point it out, and now we're finding out our borders are wrong. We're finding out that people's borders are wrong. We're finding out that people didn't do their due diligence when they're putting up boundaries and jurisdictional boundaries. And so when we found out that, hey, really don't have an easement, you can't have access, you're trespassing, this boundary is actually supposed to be over here, people are obviously like, why now? Well, it's technology, go back to technology. But for my students, what I'm really trying to do is pull them out of technology and going back into looking at the universe clock, if you will, and tying back into the universe system of solstices and equinoxes.
Great. So we're right at 2 o'clock, which means we're right on schedule. So we are going to move on to our next speaker. But Kaiti, there are a couple other questions in the chat that are really directed very specifically to you. So I will let you answer those on your own, if that's okay. And we're going to move on to our next speaker, Megan Conway. Megan Conway is the Aquatic and Riparian Habitat Specialist for the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. Her prior work includes research, monitoring, and habitat restoration for rare and endangered wetland-dependent species in Arizona, California, Florida, and the Atlantic coast. She earned her bachelor's in environmental studies from the State University of New York in Binghamton and a PhD in ecology and environmental sciences from the University of Maine. And Megan, are you able to, oh, you are sharing your screen, so, or not, you were sharing your screen. So we'll wait for a second to get that back up, and it is all yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. As Michael mentioned, my name is Megan Conway. I am the Aquatic and Riparian Habitat Specialist for the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, and I work in the Ecological and Environmental Planning Division. I'm going to focus on some of the ecological impacts of beavers and some of the benefits that they can provide for other species that depend on wetlands and riparian habitat. And so, as most of you know, riparian areas are pretty rare on the landscape, and across the Western US, wetlands cover about 2% of the landscape, yet 80% of species depend on wetlands during some point during their lifespan. And these are just a few examples of some native species in New Mexico that depend on these ecosystems, many of which do have some kind of special status at the state or federal level. Let's see if I get rid of this. So beaver are a native species that is widely distributed throughout North America and has been did a really good job of covering. They used to be much more common throughout much of their range. And as you can see on the map, their native range extends through most of New Mexico. So one of the biggest ecological impacts that beavers can have are the increase in water retention. So by impounding water in these ponds, they expand the spatial distribution of water and sometimes alter the timing of release of that water downstream. So this expands the area of saturated soils and converts upland areas into wetland and riparian plant communities. Beaver dams also slow the water velocity, which reduces erosive energy, and the increase in riparian vegetation can further enhance this effect and by dissipating all of that energy. Water retention also increases groundwater recharge and elevates the water table. This can provide a more constant supply of water for fish and riparian vegetation. Ben also mentioned this can sometimes transform intermittent streams into more perennial, constant water stream. One study also showed that beaver have a substantial effect on the amount of open water in wetlands, one causing a 9-fold increase in open water area compared to similar wetlands that didn't have beavers. Beaver dams can also reduce the peak flow. It's the amount of water at one particular time, reducing the impact of severe flooding events, and spreads that flow out over longer time periods. And this storage of water within the stream reach is particularly important for many aquatic species during low flow periods when other direct inputs are limited. And this can help mitigate the effect of climate-induced drought or loss of snowpack. So other ecological impacts include increased habitat complexity. So they can transform a flowing stream into a variety of pools and ponds with a variety of moving and slower moving backwater channels. These slow water habitats are important for birds, waterfowl, fish, aquatic invertebrates, mammals, and amphibians. And again, by increasing this riparian area, they can also provide important habitat for terrestrial plants and animals. So as you can see in these photos, the top one shows a very narrow meandering channel, but the habitat around it is pretty homogeneous, whereas the beaver influenced pond in the bottom photo shows a variety of different channels coming in on the bottom. You can see on the left and the right big open water space in the middle, and more additional streams shooting off of that big pond, both to the left and to the right there. A lot of shrubs and wet meadows surrounding that area. And so the natural movement of beavers on the landscape also leads to this pattern of colonization of new areas and abandoning of old dams, or dams can also be breached by flooding events. These abandoned dams eventually drain and transform into wet beaver meadows. And across the larger landscape, this creates what we sometimes refer to as a patch mosaic. So that's basically creates a landscape where wetlands are in different successional stages, which just creates a diversity of different structural habitat types, patches of different habitat across the larger landscape. And this often results in increases in diversity of species and increase in resilience to floods and droughts. And the raised water table and nutrient-rich soil left behind can also benefit plant growth long after beaver have abandoned the site. So this was a good depiction. This is a time sequence of aerial photos, provides a nice example of that development and subsequent abandonment of beaver dams that creates what we refer to as the patch mosaic. There's patches of different habitat types across the landscape. You can see on the photo of the left, prior to beaver colonization, there's no ponds or dams yet. The photo in the middle, where a pond is present, where there was a dam created. And the photo all the way to the right, where beaver had subsequently abandoned that pond. It created a nice meadow there, and they recolonized about 200 meters downstream, and eventually a new wetland will form there. So this was also a nice illustration by Ben Goldfarb that appeared in Science just a couple of years ago. It's a time series, so the first photo on the left shows a degraded channel with deep trenches where beaver dam analogs were recently installed. The next section shows the channel widening, and that diverted flow causes sediment to accumulate and raises that riverbed. And as that riverbed gets raised, water starts to flow onto the floodplain in that third photo. And you can see the increase in groundwater recharge, growth of vegetation, and these conditions allow beavers to recolonize. And then they continue that work, and you see this resulting maze of pools and side channels that provide a lot of benefit for fish and wildlife. Some other impacts are those on temperature and nutrients. So although beaver dams can increase riparian vegetation, which provides some nice shade and cooler microclimate, there's concern that large areas of open water might increase the water temperatures, which could be detrimental to some cold water fish. However, when they create these large, deep ponds, at least 6 feet deep, they tend to stratify, which means that cooler water sinks to the bottom, and then near the top, this thin layer of warm, productive surface water. And this is usually separated by a sharp temperature gradient. So this creates a cool water in the depth of the beaver pond. That's a temperature refuge for fish during the hotter parts of the day, and creates a productive surface layer for foraging during the cooler times during the night and early mornings. Few studies show that beaver ponds can also stabilize or moderate fluctuations in temperature, but again, this can depend on the size of the pond and the particular habitat. So they also trap woody debris, lots of vegetation, soil, and other organic matter. And this woody debris on the pond floor can be important habitat for fish, amphibians, and aquatic invertebrates, including a lot of insects and invertebrates that live at the bottom of lake beds that aren't often present when in the faster moving parts of streams. And again, after they abandon, they leave behind this nutrient-rich, productive soil that can enhance rapid plant growth later on. So we just went through a lot of the more broad ecological processes. So I'm going to start going through a couple of case studies to show how these impacts might vary, how different species respond, and kind of show how beaver can benefit specific habitats and wildlife species. So this study, the graph shows an increase in plant species richness. So that's just the total number of species with the length of time beaver were present in this habitat. And although this was, I think, in Europe somewhere, there's another study in New York that also showed an increase of 33% in plant species richness across the landscape where beavers were present. This is another study that also showed an increase in plant diversity and beetle abundance. So you can see this graph on the left shows an increase in dissimilarity in beaver versus other wetlands. Dissimilarity is just a measure of how much the species change or how many different species you encounter as you move across the landscape. The middle graph shows, again, species richness, so the total plant species number was again greater in beaver ponds than it was in other wetlands. And while the number of species of beetle didn't change or vary across different types of ponds, they did show that beetle abundance was much greater in these beaver-created wetlands, mostly due to the variety of plant species that were present and the habitat structure and variety that was available. So this is another study. This was across the national parks across the Rocky Mountains. They showed beaver can provide some habitat benefits to amphibian populations. So the squares here are from beaver-influenced ponds, and the circles are other types of wetlands. And while not all the sites or species that they studied showed a difference between these two wetland types, they did show higher occupancy in beaver-influenced ponds for both the boreal toad and Columbia spotted frog. They also showed that many of the species that they surveyed for were declining, and some were very rare in the landscape, particularly at Rocky Mountain National Park. So they suggested that beaver could potentially provide a buffer for this decline by providing a good habitat for these species, or they could also provide habitat where these species were fairly rare on the landscape. So beaver can also enhance fish habitat. Most studies I came across were from the Pacific Northwest, so relevant to salmon and trout species, and less is known about dryland systems in the Southwest. But a recent meta-analysis noted that the most common benefits across a range of studies were increased habitat complexity, provision of rearing and overwintering habitat for fish, refuge from these high flow velocities, or temperature refuge, and a very productive invertebrate community. So the slow flows and large edge to surface area ratios that beaver ponds can provide cover for fish, and also this very productive environment for both vegetation and aquatic invertebrates. Fish also spend a lot less energy foraging in these slow productive waters in beaver ponds and side channels, so this can increase fish abundance and size. However, these effects can vary over space and time. So again, depending on the stream reach, the particular habitat type, and these responses can also vary among species. And some caution is that these conditions created by beaver can also be favored by some non-native fish, especially those that prefer deep pool habitats. One study documented a turnover to more non-native fish that was on the Green River in Arizona following beaver colonization. So whether these non-native species are beneficial or desirable may depend on the particular stream reach, and just something to be considered during restoration planning. So this is a map from a study in Central Oregon, showed an increase in habitat diversity in beaver influenced section of a river. They show habitat diversity here as different shades of blue on the map on the left. So these different shades of blue are different water depths. And they tagged individual steelhead trout and then mapped their movements across each of these stream reaches. And they found that trout spread out and used a lot more microhabitat types near beaver dams than in other parts of the river. And this resulted in an increase in both density and survival for this species. The northern leather-side chub is a rare minnow, the patchy distribution across its range in Utah, Idaho, Nevada, and Wyoming. And this fish is thought to occur in stream reaches with high habitat complexity. And this study did show that they occurred more often in sites with more complex stream flows. So these are just places that contained a variety of both fast and slow moving water. And they also connected that to beaver by showing that these complex stream flows that are preferred by this fish were more prevalent when active or abandoned beaver dams were present. So another study in the same watershed, this is the Upper Snake River Basin, also showed that fish diversity increases in response to these 4 different indices of habitat complexity. So the diversity of cover types, different plants that provide shade and cover for species, substrate diversity, so a mix of sand, gravel, larger rocks, variation in water velocity, again, so parts of the stream that are fast moving and slow moving contained in the same area, and variation in water depth. Beaver can also provide a benefit for bird habitat. Can they create open water habitats, which are preferred by waterfowl, wading birds, and marsh birds. They provide an abundant food source of aquatic insects. The lush riparian vegetation provides both a cool, moist microclimate that's preferred by a lot of species, shade for temperature refuge, and also includes tall trees, shrubs, and herbaceous vegetation that provides cover from predators. And of course, when they flood an area, some trees will die, and that provides snags for cavity nesting species, such as flicker, other woodpeckers, and other species that nest in old tree cavities. So this study was on the Zuni Pueblo. They showed a positive impact for 2 federally listed species, the southwest willow flycatcher, pictured there on the top, and the western yellow-billed cuckoo there on the bottom. They reintroduced 23 beavers to 7 different restoration areas. And within 3 to 5 years, they saw an increase in surface and groundwater and an increase in riparian vegetation. The increase in the water table resulted in decline of salt cedar and increased willow habitat because it's more tolerant to inundation for long periods of time. And they showed a positive increase in the number of southwest willow flycatcher territories. So they had 3 to 5 prior to the reintroductions and added an additional 5 territories, 3 in a large 100-acre wetland complex that was created by the beaver introduction, and 2 at a second site where beaver extended a lot of the riparian vegetation. They also saw their first yellow-billed cuckoo detection in the area, and a lot of habitat provided for snipe and waterfowl in another 50-acre wetland. So another study on the San Pedro River. This is one of the last few free-flowing streams. It's located in southeast Arizona. And they show here on the top graph an increase in the number of species where beaver were present versus areas where they were absent. And on the bottom graph, they show an increase in abundance of all the individual birds that they counted, again, in places where beaver were present versus where they were absent. And they found that these effects even persisted after accounting for attributes such as the amount of water present or the width and area of riparian habitat available. So this shows that the impact of beaver-created habitat can vary. And this particular study shows the highest diversity after a beaver had abandoned a site. So this top graph shows bird species richness. So the bird species richness was highest in old beaver ponds, then lakes, rivers, and active beaver ponds. On this bottom graph shows the abundance of 3 plant types for each of these 4 sites. Again, the abandoned beaver ponds, river, active ponds, and lakes. And they attributed the increase in bird species richness to the growth of dense alder shrubs and grass cover, which was higher in these abandoned beaver ponds. And although this study is from Quebec, which is a little bit different habitat, it does illustrate that the timing of changes in species richness can vary depending on the habitat type. And again, is a good illustration of this pattern of succession following beaver abandonment that creates different types of habitat patches across the larger landscape. And it also might be important to take into account at what scale you measure this diversity. So a site level scale versus across the broader landscape. So beaver can also provide good habitat for the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse. This is a federally listed species and is an extreme habitat specialist. They require dense herbaceous vegetation with moist soil, so they don't often stray far from water. The loss of beaver habitat was listed as one of the top stressors and reasons for the species decline. And beaver restoration was also listed as one of the top opportunities for conservation and recovery in the most recent species status assessment by Fish and Wildlife Service. And another study also found that wetlands associated with beaver dams on the Rio Cebolla naturally excluded cattle. So they were naturally excluded by the saturated soil associated with beaver wetlands. Oops, sorry. And so most of you are also familiar with the impacts of climate change, such as warming temperatures, shifts in timing and quantity of precipitation, and the timing and intensity of snowmelt that results in changes in stream flow. So the maps on the right show past changes in temperature on the top and precipitation on the bottom. So the warmer colors, the reds, oranges, and yellows, are areas that have gotten warmer or drier, and the cooler blues and greens where climate has gotten cooler or wetter. So of course this drying can lead to loss of riparian vegetation and shifts in species distributions. Many species that depend on riparian areas within New Mexico are vulnerable to climate change. So this is a study by Friggins and colleagues. It was conducted to study and assess the vulnerability of riparian obligate species along the Middle Rio Grande. And they developed scores based on species traits. So here, negative scores mean species are more resilient or adaptable to change and will fare better under a climate change scenario. And those with positive scores are more vulnerable. And as you can see from these graphs, each of these columns is the number of species in each score going across the bottom. And most of these bins show that most of the species are greater than 0, which means that they're more vulnerable to climate change. And they included lots of different traits. So if your habitat is likely to shift with climate, if you have particular adaptations that will allow you to deal with heat, stress, or those dependent on water availability, and other traits like that kind of encompassed a lot of different adaptations that were possible. So how can beaver help? Water storage from beaver impoundments can help recharge groundwater and elevate the water table. Again, this might be an effective tool to help mitigate and associate the associated reductions in water resources during drought. The slower release of water might also mitigate reductions in snowpack or changes in timing of snowmelt. They provide a more constant supply of water for both aquatic species and riparian vegetation. And the more complex habitat and deep pools can provide thermal refuge for fish. The increased riparian corridor provides cooler, moist microhabitats for terrestrial species, and also provide movement corridors and resting stops for migrating birds. So that is all I have, but if you have any questions at any time, this is my contact information. And just to give another plug for the rest of the sessions on Monday, both Nick Foreman and Jeff Ogden from Game and Fish will be giving talks on Monday, some of the regulatory perspectives, and Jeff is going to be talking about some kind of adaptations to help deal with living with beaver on the landscape.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. Before we move on to our final speaker, there was one question that was fairly specific that I figured we could deal with now. From Melissa, the Zuni Pueblo example was dated 2000. Do you know the current status of that program?
Oh, I do not, but I can find out. It would be interesting to see what the wetlands look like now.
Great, yeah, so Melissa, you see her contact information on the screen still. So if you want to write that down, and you could contact Megan directly. So before we move on to the next, was anyone counting how many species Megan mentioned in her presentation? I think that alone is a great example of just how widespread the positive impacts beavers have for all sorts of different type of wildlife species. So our final speaker for today is Bill Zedike. Bill Zedike and his wife Mary have enjoyed the presence of beaver at their property on Manuelitas Creek for 11 of the past 16 years, with a particular interest in how the presence or absence of beaver affect other species. Bill retired from the U.S. Forest Service in 1990 with 34 years experience as a wildlife biologist. He began a second career in wetland restoration in 1995 and plans to retire this year with 25 years of service as a consultant on state, federal, tribal, and private lands in 7 states and Mexico. He has authored several publications on riparian restoration and protection, and conducted many training sessions for volunteers, professionals, and landowners on how to think like a beaver while fixing damaged creeks and wetlands. And I'm sure anyone who has been involved in any sort of restoration work, wetland restoration work in New Mexico, is familiar with Bill. So it's a great, great honor to have him here. So Bill, are you all set to go? It looks like you still need to unmute yourself. Let's see. And then share screen. And Chris, I'm sure you're standing by if we need a little bit of an assist.
Yeah, Bill or Brian. Oh, there you go. You are off mute, Bill, and good to go.
Okay, I'm not sure of the lighting, but I'm sorry about that.
You look great.
Okay. Maybe that'll help. That helps a little bit, I hope. So my presentation is going to be oral without any illustrations. So you all can close your eyes and rest a little bit, and I'll try to hit some high points having to do with the beaver ecology from my perspective. And I really appreciated the previous talks by Ben and Margaret, Megan. So, and I'm sorry, the other name. So I think an important thing that we need to maybe bring up is that beaver ecology varies greatly by site and by type of watershed. And that has a lot to do with whether or not we can restore beavers to a given watershed and what the results and outcomes are likely to be. And that's because beavers affect hydrology, which is volume of water and when it comes and how frequently we recharge a watershed, and finally how long the discharge lasts. So beavers can affect the volume or the timing or the repetitiveness, but they can affect the discharge from a given watershed. And so that makes them extremely valuable, as Megan's presentation just demonstrated. The next important thing is the geomorphology. And the geomorphology, simply put, is whether we have sedimentation or we have erosion. Do we have aggradation or do we lose soil from the area in question? And then finally is ecology. How does the change in water abundance and timing and the change in sedimentation or erosion affects the ecology of a given site? So that's what I call a trilogy, and everything that we do affects the nature of the trilogy and the effects. So I'm going to talk a little bit to 3 examples of beavers presence that has to do with the trilogy: hydrology, geomorphology, and ecology. And the first one I'm going to talk to is what I call miners. Beavers in this situation are gold miners. They exist, they use the resources, and they leave. And what I'm especially concerned about is beavers in steep slope watersheds there where the dominant vegetation is aspen. So beavers can exist and live high on the hog when aspen are in easy reach, close to the water, so that the beavers can cut the aspen and haul the cut pieces down to the stream and use them for food, or use them to build a house if the situation's right, or use them to build a dam. So while the aspen are numerous, the beavers can be very successful. But the problem is that the more they use the aspen, the further upslope they have to go to cut them down. And the further upslope they go, the longer it is to the creek where they can take refuge if a predator comes. So what happens with time is the beavers use all the aspen in reach. They're subject to predation by coyotes or bears or mountain lions or whatever the case may be. And so that colony crashes. And after it's gone, then we find a situation where the aspen stumps may start to sprout again, but then it's prime food for elk and deer. And so we have a situation where the aspen no longer survive and as a resource for the beaver in that situation. And usually these narrow headwater streams do not support a very dense stand of willows. Sometimes they do, but usually they don't. So there's not an alternative food source for beavers to occupy that site. And the beavers will be gone, sadly, until we have a catastrophic fire that results in creating enough suitable response from the aspen that the aspen colonizer regenerates in that site. And then after a few years, we have a resource again that can support beavers. And I've seen many areas, higher elevations with steep slopes in New Mexico where that situation occurs. The next example is what I call the beavers aren't miners, the beavers are farmers. And beavers are farmers when we have a slightly wider, flatter, perennial stream where they can create the habitats such as we just saw beautifully in the previous speaker's illustrations of various places where the beavers have built their dams in a series and totally re-wetted and restored the watershed. Well, what happens when they do that? We have a big increase in normally shrubs, various species of willows. So the willows become the food source to sustain the beavers. And if the beavers eat the willows, they sprout back. So the beaver, we have a situation where the beavers are sustaining the willow populations and the willows are sustaining the beavers. So it's I can't remember the word I need. I'm sorry, my time's catching up with me. Mutualism, if we wanted to call it that. So that, to me, is very meaningful because our best opportunities to restore beavers are when we have flatter stream gradients and wider valleys where we can get that willow response and the populations can grow. Some of their earlier illustrations showed that very well. And then we have the final situation, which I call the beaver city dwellers. They're like beavers that live in large rivers like the Rio Grande in the vicinity of Albuquerque. They survive there. They feed where they need to feed. But they don't build dams. They usually live in bank dens. They don't change the habitat very much, such as what life is like to live in a city. I guess I have my biases. So if we take those images into account, we can think about where our best opportunities are to have a successful and productive beaver restoration activity. And we need to find landowners who are happy to have beavers and support the efforts to restore them. I first studied beavers in New Hampshire when I was a junior at the University of New Hampshire in 1955, and I surveyed about 40 miles of streams trying to locate and identify the number of beavers. And the way I counted the beavers, kind of crude, but I beat on the house until the beavers poured out, and I counted the splashes, and I knew how many beavers were in that population, or I thought I did. And I inventoried beavers on about 40 miles of stream, and I started to learn some significant things, and they kind of support the comments I just made. Beavers were present on the steeper 3 to 4% mountain streams, but their food supply was limited by the depth of snow in the winter and small ponds that they could construct on such steep channels, whereas the beavers that were in the valley bottom and had flatter, wider streams where their dams could inundate a lot larger area and get the stimulus from the willows and so forth, survived better. They weren't at risk like the beavers that were in the headwater streams. So, and I worked for the Forest Service for 34 years, and I was stationed in many different areas in the East, and finally, happily, in the Southwest in Albuquerque, I was Director of Fisheries and Wildlife for this region of the Forest Service. But I learned about beavers in Kentucky. I was on the Daniel Boone National Forest. We had a few, very few populations because beavers had been wiped out and they had not been restocked. Then I went to Georgia, and beavers were spreading on their own. They were building many, many dams. They were seriously disliked by landowners. There was an all-out effort to trap and remove them, but the beavers still spread, and they created habitat for many species that weren't there before the beavers were. So each area you go, there's a different set of responses from the presence or absence of beavers. So we need to learn to look at what those responses are so we can select areas where beavers could be restored, and we can get good wishes and support of landowners or land managers that would welcome them back. As we know, not everybody in New Mexico welcomes beavers. So the next thing I would like to describe is the history of beavers on property that my wife and I own on Manuelitas Creek in San Miguel County, about 20 miles north of Las Vegas. And this Manuelitas Creek is top of the watershed is about 12,000 feet. We live at 7,300 feet elevation. The water flows down into Sapio Creek and then into the Rio Mora, and the Rio Mora into the Canadian River, and the Canadian into the Arkansas River, and so on into the Mississippi. So we're in the southeastern corner of New Mexico, and so we can expect to find species here that aren't found elsewhere in New Mexico, but we do have the beavers, fortunately. So if we think about the stream slope and the valley length and the valley width, we're at the area where the steep part of where the slope of this channel is about 1% instead of a 3 or 4% like it is further up valley. It's more meandering. It would be what we would call a Roskin Sea channel, not a shorter meander radius such as a Roskin B channel. So there's more potential habitat for beavers at that elevation and with that those stream features than there is up valley. We're happy to have beavers, and we had neighbors upstream and down, the next 2 landowners upstream and the next 3 landowners downstream all welcomed beavers. So we were fortunate that way. Beyond that, upstream, the landowners saw beavers as a threat to their hay meadows, and downstream likewise. But we were fortunate to have about a mile where beavers were welcome. So we were very fortunate that when my wife and I, Mary, acquired the property in 2004, there were already beavers present on the neighbor, but we found that before we purchased the property, people that hated beavers because they saw them impounding water that they might have used to irrigate their fields actually snuck in one night without permission and dynamited the beaver dams to remove them so they would have the water downstream. But by the time we moved there, the beavers were doing well right at the property line upstream with our upstream property line. The beavers were welcome on our upstream neighbor. So the dam grew with time and it reached a length of about 180 feet. And it grew to a height of about 7 feet. And it inundated about 3 acres of pond. And the beaver population grew steadily with the access to the willows. On our property, which was downstream, it was kind of funny, but I pruned an apple tree one day and I threw the branches in the creek with the notion that the beavers would eat the bark. And the beaver said, a great idea. And they started building the dam right at that spot. That was pure luck. But they built that dam to a height of 8 feet. And it flooded upstream for 800 feet to the main dam. And so this was one of a cluster of 3. The main dam at the property line, our dam 800 feet downstream, and another dam upstream, but very similar to one of the map images that Megan showed, with 3 main dams and a couple of smaller dams off to the side. So we were fortunate then to have those beavers present from basically 2004 to 2013. And we entered into an agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we fenced the valley bottom so that willows could come back, because we grazed horses on part of the pasture, but we reduced the width of the area of the pasture by about 5 acres. When the stream flooded, the water came through the barn, so we dug a ditch to divert the water around the barn so we could still have the beavers and still have a dry barn. So the point that I want to make with that is beavers are wonderful, but they ain't free. If you want to have beavers, sometimes you have to make an investment of some sort or another to make it possible to have the features and the productivity of the landscape that you want to have and still have the beavers. So when we got a grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service to fence the creek, and our next door neighbor did the same thing to fence in the large 3-acre pond. And we fenced 5 acres, and it grew into willows and changed over time. And so, because it was no longer grazed. And so the food supply available for the beavers greatly increased. And at one point we counted one evening 11 beavers in the one pond. All of those beavers weren't always safe. We had bears, we had mountain lions, we had coyotes. And occasionally we would find the skeleton or the skulls of beavers that had been killed by the predators, but the population still survived. So the next point I want to make is that our pond was very productive from 2004 to 2013. And in 2013, which was extremely dry year, the creek went totally dry. And because it was dry, all the variety of wildlife that depended on the beaver as a keystone species was greatly reduced in numbers. We lost about 25 to 28 species of birds. We lost 3 species of frogs, bullfrogs, leopard frogs, and chorus frogs. We lost our snapping turtles. We had one big old one about 30 inches in diameter. He was huge. It's gone now. And so the stream was dry for about 4 months, and we had a huge change in the variety of species. And I'd like to go through some of them and how they used the beaver pond. We had fish of 3 different species. We did a survey with the New Mexico Fish and Wildlife Department, and one of their biologists surveyed our fisheries for us, and we had 3 species, one of which was key species for birds that eat fish. And so we had kingfishers that perched in a tree that the beavers had drowned. We had great blue herons that loved it. They fished there daily, and I don't know where they went to roost or raise where the nest sites were, but they depended on our beaver pond for their food supply. We had 2 pairs of black-crowned night herons, which are quite unusual in our part of New Mexico. We had sora rails living in the cattails that were on the edge of the beaver dam and very dense, and you could hear the sora rails singing about 6 feet from you, and it was extremely hard to see them. If anybody knows sora rails, know that. And we had other songbirds. I'm having trouble with my memory, so please bear with me. But when the drought hit, we lost all those species. And the stream was dry for 4 months. All the species that had been there until that time disappeared. And then we had a big rain in October, thankfully. The beaver pond was still intact. Another pair of beavers moved back, and they occupied the site for about 2 years, and then till 2016. And then the beavers lived under the ice from November until March. So they're dependent on the willows that they can cache to survive on that are stored under the ice, or they depend on cattail roots. They're very fond of cattail, and it's a favorite food. So we had an abundance of cattail. So we had plenty of food for the beavers to survive on under the ice. But it occurred in 2016. I didn't see any fresh evidence of beavers. And when the ice melted, I found 3 dead beavers against the dam. I assume that they were killed by tularemia. I don't have proof of that. But we also lost our rabbits. We have no rabbits on our property, have had none since 2016. We lost other species. So then we had another flood it tore out the dam, and there were no beavers to restore it. So we've lost all the species that depended on or the diversity that benefited from the presence of beavers. And then we had another drought in 2018. The stream went dry again, supposed to be perennial. And 19 was a wet year. We had good floods, but no beavers to take advantage of it. 2020 is extremely dry. The creek is dry again. So I don't know if we'll get to enjoy beavers and all the pleasure that comes from their presence anytime soon. I have a couple other points and I'll be through. So beavers are well known for the Keystone Species concept. So many species benefit from the presence of beavers, but who benefits beavers? Name one species where we have the feedback that what they do tends to benefit the beavers. My friend Brian, who is sitting here by my side, thinks that muskrats may benefit beavers, and that's possible. But I think the main species that can benefit beavers is humans. They're either going to make it or break it, whether or not we assist them. So I have a saying that beavers work miracles, but they ain't free. If we want to have beavers and all the benefits that come from their presence, we have to be willing to invest in things that can help them, like the fences to protect the riparian area from grazing. There was an illustration of a culvert that had been plugged by a beaver dam. They're infamous for that, and often those beavers are killed. If we convert it, if it's a small stream, the culvert to a low water crossing, where then the chances of the beavers plugging it would be much diminished. So there may be many different kinds of treatments we could use if we used our imagination and we were willing to invest in what it takes to save beavers that would help to restore them in areas where they're now present. And I've learned working with landowners on stream and wetland restoration efforts and throughout the Southwest, that if we go out and suggest a treatment for restoration that doesn't fit the objectives of that landowner, we're probably going to fail. But if we work devotedly and as hard as we can with landowners who request help, they can show the success and they can talk with their neighbors, and we're much more apt to spread the word with the neighbors who might not be inclined to do so otherwise. I wanted to suggest a couple of other things and I'll be finished. I worked on the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge, and we did a survey on the Rio Mora. It was 5 miles in length, and there were 5 colonies of beavers, or families of beavers, or whatever term you want to use. And each had marked its territory at about a mile in length. And they always built their dams at the point where the next riffle starts. So river morphology is riffle, run, pull, glide. And glide is where the next riffle starts to form. So as my friend Van Clothier would say, a glide is where you walk uphill to go downstream. That's where the bed of the river is higher and the riffle is wide and flat, and the beavers can build a dam at that point with minimum effort and maximum depth and length of the pool. So if they use the food available to them at a given site, they can move upstream or down to the next top of another glide or beginning of another riffle and regenerate your dam at that spot and claim a new territory. And we also noticed that there were two places in that length of stream that the riffle run pool glide pattern wasn't in place. There was not a good place for the dam to be built, therefore, so there were no beavers at those two locations, and there probably never will be. And the diversity of trees and shrubs that are favorite beaver foods was greater there than it was in other areas along the river. So I could go on, but I just want to stress the point that if we're going to restore beavers as widely as possible, we need to find landowners who would support them and have them demonstrate the benefits rather than to try to hard sell the idea to people who are not so inclined. And I think I would like to sum it up at that point and join in the questioning.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. That was a really fantastic presentation. So before we get into questions, one quick announcement. Following our first session, I saw a number of questions about whether or not these sessions are being recorded and will be posted later. And the answer is yes, they are being recorded. And Chris with Wild Earth Guardians will work over the next couple of weeks to get them posted. So they won't be available right away. But you know, for any friends or colleagues who might be interested but weren't able to join for any one of these sessions, there will be an opportunity to view them later. So I'm going to go back to a question that we received at the beginning of the session from Brian Bird. When do we know when we have an ecologically meaningful population of beaver? And sorry, if all of our presenters, Megan, Ben, and Bill, could go off mute and just be prepared to field any of these questions. I think some of them might be directed to one of you specifically, but I think, you know, a question like this, we would appreciate input from anyone who, any of you who has something to say. So when do we know when we have an ecologically meaningful population of beaver?
I mentioned losing our beavers on our property in 2013, and the stream was dry for many miles, and I was familiar with the neighboring, not totally familiar, but I felt like we lost over 20 colonies or populations of beavers on that one stream that year, and huge changes in the habitat and hydrologic conditions along the stream.
I would add that, you know, that you don't need many beavers to have a really dramatic impact, right? And there's one, you know, one really remarkable study in England where Eurasian beavers were recently reintroduced, and they found that a single pair of beavers, two beavers that had built 13 dams, captured something like 100 tons of sediment, sequestered 15 tons of carbon, stored a ton of nitrogen, and created all kinds of wonderful biodiversity benefits as well. And again, that's just 2 beavers. So you don't need many of them to have a really outsized impact.
Yeah, and I would just add that I'd look at probably some ecological function, like do you have a connected floodplain, a healthy riparian habitat, good species diversity, those kind of attributes rather than a specific number of beaver on the landscape.
So there's another question that was somewhat complementary and kind of on the reverse side, but how much willow habitat area or stream length is required to support a pair of beaver?
Well, that's a good question. In our case, on Manolitas Creek, probably between 1/4 and 1/2 mile over time.
Yeah, and I can just add that for the Department of Game and Fish, when determining habitat suitability of an area for translocation or reintroduction, part of the checklist is 1/4 mile of contiguous habitat. So for Game and Fish, that's 1/4 mile is the minimum requirement.
Yeah, I don't have any specific quantity of habitat either, but I think I did come across a paper that mentioned a 50-meter buffer of riparian zone width on either side, but they didn't mention a length like you just did. So, and
Right. Oh, sorry.
habitat as well.
So another question from Carrie Paris. We're working on a plan to repair an incised stream by reconnecting hydrological function with the floodplain. I think that the area would be ideal beaver habitat but lacks nearby woody vegetation. What is your experience with planting aspens once the hydrological connections have been reestablished? We're currently experimenting with planting cottonwoods and we'll have results by next fall.
That sounds like a Bill question to me.
I have fairly strong feelings about that. We need to look at the hydrology and the steepness of slope and what types of sediments have been deposited on either side of the channel before we determine whether or not it's suitable for stocking or planting willows or cottonwoods. And I've found that stream valleys that are less steep than 1% and are bounded on both sides by good stands of aquatic vegetation like sedges and rushes and so forth. And we don't have the willows and cottonwoods present that, and they probably will not grow there because of the soil oxygen presence and so forth. That's not a good place to stock beavers. And I can name several streams where that's true. And the East Fork of the Jemez on the Valles Caldera National Monument is probably a good example. That's too wide, it lacks the shrubs that beavers need to get them through the winter. And we should be happy to have that habitat type on the landscape, but that's probably not a place where beavers have a possibility. So,
All right, and here's another question directed at you, Bill. Bill, do you believe that if your upstream neighbors on Manuleta Creek would have been open to beaver, that these upstream ponds could have supported the drought and flood occurrences that you described?
oh, that's an excellent question. I wish I had an answer, but I believe probably so. I just saw a stream in Colorado last week. I was working there, and the valley, it's a valley wide, maybe 200 yards or less. And there's several channels down through there, lots of cottonwoods and willows along the banks. And the channels indicate that Many dams in the past caused the stream channel to change location. If a dam fails on valley left and it had been flowing on valley right, then the stream moves to valley left and we have a new channel. And then they cross in the whole length of the valley. There was just one remaining pond at the top due to the drought. And I think that there was sufficient water and vegetation and food to restock beavers there. And hopefully they would begin to store some water and allow the beavers to become reestablished downstream from that one site. So there is potential.
Great, thank you. So this wasn't a question, but a comment that I thought was worth highlighting from Leslie Hay with the Southwest region of the Forest Service based in Albuquerque, I believe. If anyone is working with beaver reintroductions in New Mexico Meadow jumping mouse, I would love to talk. So you can find Leslie there in the chat. It would be great. That's a great issue that we're all very excited about. All right, are there any other, if you have questions, now is the time to type them in. Also, if you would like to go off mute and just ask a question directly, you're welcome to do that as well.
I guess I'll go ahead. I have a very broad question that I think any three of you can take a stab at, and that is what is it going to take for the kind of insights that everyone here has provided about the positive environmental impacts of beavers and their infrastructure? What is it going to take, do you think, for that kind of understanding to reach the social threshold wherein the broad perception of beavers changes? Besides us doing a summit like this every week in every state until the end of time.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I mean, to me, it seems like, you know, as I've observed other beaver change makers doing their thing, you know, to me, it just seems like having the right spokespeople on board is really, really critical. You know, there's a great beaver research group out of Utah State University, and you know they do webinars and workshops all over the country. Joe Wheaton is kind of the leader of that, and you know, and one of the ranchers they've worked with is this guy named Jay Wild, who basically reintroduced beavers to his ranch in South Idaho, and you know, and turned this seasonal stream into a perennial one. And now Jay is really you know, just this incredible evangelist for the beaver cause, who of course, because he's a rancher, you know, really speaks that language, and his word means so much in that livestock community, you know, certainly more than the word of you know, any fluvial geomorphologist or wildlife biologist. So it seems like having the right spokespeople on board and making sure the right messengers are speaking to the right audiences is just so critical. You know, finding that you know, a couple of key influencers in New Mexico on, you know, on the agricultural side of things, I think is just so critical.
I have a comment I would like to add, and that is when we exclude cattle from a riparian area with a riparian exclosure fence, in the name of riparian restoration and all the wildlife that goes with it, we change the economics of the ranch, and we almost guarantee failure in some instances, especially if those exclosures are on public land, either national forest or BLM lands or state-owned lands. But if we exclude the cattle during the growing season and let the rancher graze that area during the dormant season, there's very little impact on the willows and very little impact on the cottonwoods, and we can therefore make it profitable for the rancher, the landowner, to make it work. So rather than being totally into excluding the beavers, let's find ways that we can have the beavers and graze that system periodically so it's still profitable for the landowner.
Megan, from a game and fish perspective, did you have any thoughts on that question?
I'm not sure I have a ton to add. I think working with private landowners and showing them how that beaver can benefit them is useful, especially maybe from a perspective of farmers and increased water supply, especially when flow is low and climate adaptation perspectives might be helpful. And one of the talks on Tuesday, I think it was, gave some great landowner perspectives for that and some outreach opportunities they were involved with. And, employing some of the tools that Aaron talked about, and I think Jeff Ogburn's going to cover some mitigation techniques as well, might be helpful in kind of cohabitating and mitigating some of the negative impacts that people so often think about.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a nice plug for Monday's session that Jeff will hopefully speak to that a lot, because I know he's done some great work and has some great experience in that realm. So we have another question. How far apart can reintroduced populations be without running into problems with genetics, inbreeding, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've never, there might be people on this webinar like Heidi or Mary O'Brien who have thoughts on this too, but I've never heard of inbreeding being an issue with the reintroduction. I think that rodents in general are fairly resistant to the negative impacts of inbreeding, and so I've never heard of that being a problem.
Yeah, I don't know much. I think it would depend on their dispersal distance and how far they can travel, but I don't know a specific answer for that.
Are beavers family oriented and monogamous?
Yeah, they're definitely family oriented. They're cooperative breeders. So typical beaver family structure, you've got the male and the female who, I think like humans, they generally mate for life, but are not strictly monogamous. I think that beaver, it's sort of the traditional conception of a beaver family is a monogamous male and female. With generally 3-year classes of offspring, the newborn kits, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds, all cohabitating in that lodge together. And then during their second year, those 2-year-olds will disperse out, looking for their own territories.
And another plug for Monday's session, we will have Scott McFarland from Bandelier National Monument, where they have actively been translocating beavers for the past 2 years, and I believe he will have some good insight on some of those lessons on the amount of distance you need to introduce different groups and the benefits of introducing family groups versus individuals. So Scott should have some really good information and insights to share on that question.
Just while we're pausing here, one more pitch to attend Monday is if the right messenger for you is a fluvial ecogeomorphologist, Joe Wheaton from Utah State University will be one of the speakers on Monday as well.
Great.
I think fluvial geomorphologists are the best messengers no matter what the issue is.
They aren't in general, but Joe is actually an amazing messenger. He's a good talker.
Well, we have just about 10 minutes to go here, but we certainly don't need to use the entire time because we've been on for the better part of 2 hours and it's Friday afternoon. So if you do have any final questions, please get them into the chat now, or feel free to go off mute and just ask them directly. So we'll pause and give you a moment to do that. But otherwise, we'll sign off for today, and we'll see you on the next business day, Monday. Very exciting. Just keep on rolling with the New Mexico Virtual Beaver Summit. What is the contact info for Monday? So I will just type directly into the chat, nmbeaversummit.org. And once you get there, one of the buttons right there on the homepage will be schedule and registration. And you'll just scroll down there and there will be registration information for Monday's session as well as Wednesday's session.
And I had a few people contact me during this session saying they had trouble getting in. You do have to register for each session separately. So having registered for one is not enough. You've got to do it for each one that you want to attend.
All right. Well, on that note, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm here in Colorado, and I'd like somebody to correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the main obstacle for beaver reintroduction in this state is water law, that every single drop of water has to be accounted for and like immediately ushered downstream to that end user. I don't know, maybe something else is the bigger obstacle in Colorado. We kind of have more arcane water law than a lot of our neighboring states that are doing much better in that regard. So somebody care to correct me? No.
I don't. It's a great point and a great question. I can't really speak to Colorado's water law specifically, but that certainly has been an issue. We haven't talked a whole lot about beaver dam analog projects during these seminars, or this today's seminar. But beaver dam analogs, I mean, basically human-built beaver dams, that are designed as sort of starter kits for beavers. And and it's certainly true that I'm certainly familiar with projects in Wyoming, Utah, and elsewhere where these beaver dam analogs have been sort of delayed or prevented altogether, because the project leaders had to obtain some kind of permit from the state engineer's office and were unable to. So there certainly are people in the beaver community who are concerned that water law will thwart beaver dam analog projects. No doubt about that.
Yeah, and I can just add a specific example in New Mexico in the Sacramento Mountains, where there is New Mexico meadow jumping mouse critical habitat and a small population there. There would be a strong need for a beaver dam analog project, but given some legal uncertainties around what a beaver dam analog delaying water delivery, what that means for private water rights, and just that threat of a lawsuit, I think has created some difficulties to move forward with projects there. So, I imagine that at some point that question would be litigated, and we'd get a definitive answer. But I think it goes back to some of the misconceptions that a number of the speakers talk about, that beaver dams aren't stealing water, merely delaying it. But yeah, it's a good question. And we did have another question from Leslie. Will there be any working groups organized on beaver reintroduction issues? So one of the things that I think we really hope to do on the Wednesday session with Mary O'Brien is have a larger conversation. So unlike these past two sessions and Monday sessions, it's going to be less focused on presentations and more focused on conversations and ideas for next steps. So that's certainly one that I think would be really good to bring up during that session. The one thing I'll say is that Defenders, we commissioned a beaver habitat suitability model earlier this year. In this fall, we have partnered with Trout Unlimited to go to ground truth that model. because the model mostly takes into account morphological factors, but doesn't get into things like available vegetation. So ground truthing is going out and seeing if there is that available food source. So I think that's, and that would be one step towards, determining, where it would be suitable to put beaver, what areas might need some habitat work before beavers could reintroduce. So, as we kind of grow that project, whether it becomes a working group or takes some other form, I think those are questions we'd really like to answer. And the more input that we have, especially from the Forest Service and from Game and Fish, would be really appreciated.
I have a question for Game and Fish. We had a rule for years about reintroducing beavers, and you had to have the signed approval of all your neighbors for 5 miles up and downstream. And so there were very few places where beavers could be restored unless they were very large ranches who owned more than 10 miles of stream. Is that policy still in effect?
I think there is some version of that still, but that would be a great question for Nick Foreman, who works directly on that, moving beaver around and reintroductions and responding to nuisance complaints. So I don't know the exact requirements there, but Michael, do you know?
Yeah, so it used to be, it was a 5-mile radius. So theoretically, a landowner didn't even need to be in the watershed, but still needed their approval. But a couple of years ago, that rule was switched, so it was 5 miles upstream and 5 miles downstream. So that rule does still exist. And that's one of the reasons why Bandelier National Monument is prioritized, is because it's a big block of federal land. And to kind of account for that, in the model that we commissioned, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. One of the layers that we put on there was 10 miles of single ownership to get around that requirement. So I get, one side of that is that it was, I think, almost exclusively Forest Service land that ended up popping out. Which is, it's great because, you can move forward. And I know a lot of people with the forest are excited about beaver repatriation, but at the same time, there's a lot of habitat areas that were excluded or were not identified, especially in Northeast New Mexico, the Las Vegas area, kind of Bill's home turf. That it's much more patchwork as far as land ownership, and despite being otherwise suitable, could be very difficult to get all the necessary approvals.
Great reason to show up to Monday and listen to Nick Foreman as well.
This is Mary O'Brien. Is there a reason 5 miles was chosen? Can you think ecologically why that might have been necessary?
I would, oh, go ahead, Michael.
No, you go ahead, Megan.
My only guess would be either the movement of beavers, like how far they disperse on the landscape, or how far the effects of the water flooding might occur that might impact some landowner that's nearby. But those are just guesses. So.
This might be a guess, but I think it's the principle that you either love beavers or you hate them. And if you were wanting beavers on a 5-mile reach with several landowners, probably be a pretty good chance that one of them wouldn't want beavers. So there you go. But maybe I shouldn't have said that.
Well, I think we are right at 3:30, and one of the comments that we got during that exchange was Beavers should have the right of first refusal. So maybe that's a good place to leave our session today. Thank you again to our panelists, to Ben, Bill, Megan, and Kai T. We really appreciate you spending so much time with us today and answering everyone's questions. And again, nmbeaversummit.org is the website to register for Monday and Wednesday sessions. And you can please feel free to reach out to Chris Smith or me if you have any questions. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll hope to see you again on Monday.